Hi, so we're going to be talking about obscenity this time, and we'll be looking at this language Gugu Yimedier, which is a language, an indigenous language of Australia. And it's got a really interesting phenomenon having to do with kinship, and especially with mothers-in-law. So I'm going to begin with a couple of mother-in-law jokes. First one, never speak even when spoken to. This is the golden rule for the son-in-law. And this next one is kind of a long one, and I've never been able to find an author for it. You can find it in various forms on the internet. So here's how it goes. Man returns home from the night shift and goes straight up to the bedroom. He finds his wife with the sheet pulled over her head, fast asleep. Not to be denied, the husband crawls under the sheet and proceeds to make love to her. Afterward, as he hurries downstairs for something to eat, he's startled to find breakfast on the table and his wife pouring coffee. "How'd you get down here so fast?" he asks. "We were just making love." "Oh my God," his wife gasps. "That's my mother up there. She came over early and had complained of having a headache. I told her to lie down for a while." Rushing upstairs, the wife runs to the bedroom. "Mother, I can't believe this happened. Why didn't you say something?" The mother-in-law huffs. "I haven't spoken to that jerk for 15 years, and I wasn't about to start now." Okay, so I should just add that I like my mother-in-law, so none of this is meant to be any reflection on myself or my relationship with her. But it does point to something interesting. There are two things going on here. One is, well, of course, that the relationship with the mother-in-law is kind of thought to be fraught, right? So sons-in-laws and mothers-in-law don't get along, and so they don't talk to each other. The other thing is that you're not supposed to have sex with your mother-in-law. If you do, it gets you on places like Jerry Springer in the United States. And in fact, until not so long ago, there was a law in England that you couldn't marry your mother-in-law. Kind of a complicated law, but apparently the law was overturned, and there was a man who was famous for being the first man to legally marry his mother-in-law. He divorced his wife and married her mother. Honestly, I find that whole thing a little weird, but let's move on from there. The idea is that there's something odd and uncomfortable about marrying, or having sex, I should say, with your mother-in-law. And a lot of that accounts for what's going on in this language, Gugu Yimedier. And I'll start with these two rules, these two taboos. It's taboo for a man to speak to his mother-in-law, and it's taboo for a woman to speak to her son-in-law. This is a very strong taboo, right? It's not taboo in our culture to do that. In the United States, it would not be taboo for a man to talk to his mother-in-law or vice versa, despite our jokes. But in this culture, it truly is taboo, and at one time, it was even a law that if you were to break it, it could be punishable by death. So if a man were to speak to his mother-in-law, the punishment could be death. Now, I should add that this particular analysis is going to be from the point of view of the man, because that's the way that the article I'm basing it on was written. Okay, there's a couple of things we've got to understand. There's two ways of talking that are important to this discussion. There's Gugu Mul, which is to be without words, and there's Guya Gural, which is saying nothing. Now, it would seem that those should be similar, right? If you're without words, then you can't say anything. But in fact, they're really quite polar opposites. Gugu Mul is the relationship that a man is in with his mother-in-law, without words. Literally, every word of the language is taboo with that person. Right? So this is a very specific taboo that you are, Gugu Mul with this particular person and nobody else. But it does mean that everything in the language is taboo. Guya Gural, on the other hand, this one down here, that one is kind of opposite. This is the relationship where you can say anything, right? And you say jokes, you talk about anything. Right, so I think the closest expression that we've got in English to Guya Gural would be shooting the shit. Right, just talking about nonsense. You can talk about anything And this, again, refers to a particular relationship. And I always ask my people in the face-to-face class, what would be your guess? Like in your culture, who can you shoot the shit with? Well, people always say, well, my friends. Of course, you can shoot the shit with your friends. And a lot of people talk about their siblings, right? So they shoot the shit with their siblings. Nobody ever mentions their parents, right? That you don't shoot the shit with your parents. And likewise, in Gugu Yimidir, the Guya Gural relationship is not with your parents. Instead, it's with your grandparents. Now, I didn't have that relationship with my grandparents, but I suppose there are people in our culture who do have a very joking relationship with their grandparents. They can say anything, they can make jokes. And apparently that's the way it is in Gugu Yimidir, that you make jokes with your grandparents, and it's a safe relationship where you can say anything, you can make jokes, you can make body jokes, right? They can be raunchy, they can be sexual. So that's okay in that relationship. And it seems that this is important in the culture, that you've got people that you can talk to freely in that way. Now, to understand this all, though, we've got to understand a little bit about the way that kinship breaks down in this society. So the very first thing is that the society is broken into moieties. And the moiety is basically just a way of kind of carving up a community or a society into two parts. There's my moiety and there's their moiety. Right? And the idea is, as I understand it, is that this is to ensure sort of that there's enough depth in the gene pool that people are marrying kind of outside of their group. And so the rule is then that you can't marry somebody of the same moiety as you are. Well, your brothers and your sisters are all going to be the same moiety. So that's going to ensure that you're not going to marry your sister. If you're a man, you're not going to marry your sister. That would be too weird, right? So down here, your sisters would be Ganhal and Jingur. Would also be your cousins. So the 0 means this is my generation, right? So it's everybody in my generation. My brothers would be then Yaba and Garga. Right? So these are going to be the same moiety as I am and the same generation as I am. And then people a generation older than me would be Mugagai and Biba, and then on the female side, Bimur, and then there's the Gami, which is the same for both male and female. And that's that Guya Gural, that you can say anything in that relationship. Right, so the Gami with the people down here, that's the person that you can just shoot the shit with. So in your same moiety. Now, what happens then is that since you have to marry outside of your moiety, you look over here for prospective mates. Right? So, again, from the male's perspective, then you're going to look over here to Jiro. Now, the important thing, though, is you're always marrying outside of your moiety, and you inherit your moiety from your father. And what that ensures is that your mother, which is going to be up here, female on the one generation older, of the opposite moiety. So you're never going to have the same moiety as your mother. Which means then that if we're going to look for the mothers of the Jiral, right, these females who are the prospective brides, they're going to be up here. They're going to have the same moiety as me, generation older. These people are my prospective mothers-in-law, which means that I have to treat them with a certain amount of deference. Right? I have to be careful around those people. Likewise, this is a prospective father-in-law. And I also have to be careful with my father-in-law, and these are prospective brothers-in-law. Right? And again, I have to be careful with those people. And I think that the same thing goes in our society, right? That your prospective father-in-law. So if you start dating a woman in our society, it's a little frightening the first time that you meet her father or you meet her brothers, because they're protective of her, right? And it's going to be the same thing in this culture. They're going to be protective of their sister or their daughter. Okay, so now that we've got that understood, all of these gray areas, these are people who are somewhat dangerous to us. This because she could be a prospective mother-in-law, prospective father-in-law, or prospective brothers-in-law. Which gives us the Taboo people. So the Biwul is the actual mother-in-law. So you've got a bride, right? You've married a woman, and now you have a mother-in-law. She's dangerous, right? Certainly don't want to have sex with her, but you don't even want to talk to her, because apparently the idea is that talking may lead to sex. And so better just to leave all words off limits. You cannot talk to her at all. The Bimur, again, these are people who are potential mothers-in-law. You can talk to them, but you got to be careful. So you are really careful about what you say with these people. And then there's the Gandina, the father-in-law, and the Ganyin. These are this is your brother-in-law. And these are also people, you can talk to them, but you've got to be careful in what you say. You don't want them to get angry with you. So, there's this language for taboo people, right? Where you've got this particular variety of the language that has a lot of words that are just off limits. So it's sort of a sub-vocabulary of the normal language, the everyday language. And so there are certain words that are off limits with these people. And this is the Gugu Dabu, the language of of these taboo people. So gulun, penis, is totally off limits because it makes you think about sex. You don't want to think about sex with prospective mothers-in-law, and you certainly don't want to talk about sex with your father-in-law or your brothers-in-law, because that's going to make them start thinking about what you are doing with their daughter or their sister. Waterby, axe, apparently that's a phallic symbol. And so again, you avoid it. Nambar, stone, that's again, it kind of makes people think about sex. Stones make people think about testes and so on. Water, again, I think that's clear again, that makes you think of a female body part now instead of a male body part. All of those somehow make you think about sex. And then there are some words that are just deemed too impolite. So there are words for kangaroo that are off limits. And in fact, all but one word for kangaroo is off limits with these people. Now, other people, you may have to be a little bit circumspect. So, for example, with your sister, it can't be completely taboo to talk to your sister. And it's not even, it's not even as taboo as it would be with your brother-in-law. But you still avoid talking about sex and things like that. It's just not as strict. The taboos aren't as strong with your sister as it would be with, say, your brother-in-law. Now, this, again, all kind of comes back to this idea of sex. And that seems to be the motivation for these taboos. Now, again, this data is all based on a landmark paper written by John Haviland in 1979. And the paper is great, but it's been confirmed repeatedly that this is the culture and the taboos of the Gugu Yimidir, which again takes some of the same ideas that we've got in other cultures, but the way it manifests itself is culturally specific. And that's what we've seen throughout these presentations on the cross-cultural taboos.